and he didn't respond after that. I walked back toward the tent and called his name, and there was no answer. So I pulled the flap open. I remember that trip mostly because of how far in we decided to go without really planning it. This was out near Lost Creek Wilderness in Colorado sometime in late August, and it was just me and Ryan. We had gone in thinking we'd stick to one of the marked spots along the trail, but we kept walking past them since they were either occupied or too close to other groups, and after a while, we were far enough in that turning back didn't make sense, so we cut off the trail and found a spot on our own. It wasn't really a clearing, more like a narrow open stretch between trees with a dry creek bed running a few feet off to one side, and the ground there was uneven, but flat enough for a tent if you picked the right spot. And I remember noticing a few old stones placed in a rough circle near the creek, not like a fire ring, more like they had been set down one by one without a clear pattern. And Ryan said it was probably just hikers messing around. We set up before it got dark and didn't bother with a fire since it wasn't that cold, just used a lantern and kept things simple. And for a while, everything felt normal, just quiet in that way it usually gets out there once it's fully dark. At some point, we both started hearing the same thing, but neither of us mentioned it immediately. It was a sound coming from the creek bed, like small rocks shifting one at a time, not rolling, just a single movement, then nothing. Then again after a gap, and it kept happening without getting closer or farther, just staying in that same area. After a while, Ryan stood up and walked over to the edge of the creek to check it out, and I stayed back near the tent watching him, and he didn't go all the way down, just stood at the edge looking into it, and then he turned back and said there was nothing there. No animals, nothing moving. He came back and sat down, and the sound stopped for a bit after that, long enough that we both relaxed again, and then it started again. But this time, it wasn't from the creek. It was coming from somewhere behind us, closer than before. And I turned expecting to see something moving through the trees, but there was nothing there. We didn't go looking that time. We just stayed where we were, and after a few minutes, Ryan said he was going to lie down for a bit, so he went into the tent while I stayed outside with the lantern, and I remember sitting there listening to the same pattern of sounds, except now it was moving, not in a straight line, but shifting position in small jumps, like it would be to the left for a while. And then, suddenly, from the right, without crossing the space between. At some point, I looked toward the creek again, and the stones we had noticed earlier looked different, not in number, but in how they were placed, like they had been nudged slightly out of where they were before, and I wasn't completely sure of it, so I stood up and walked a few steps closer to check. Right when I did that, I heard Ryan speak from inside the tent, asking if I had moved the stones earlier, and I said no, and he didn't respond after that. I walked back toward the tent and called his name, and there was no answer. So I pulled the flap open, and he was there, lying in the same position, but awake, just looking straight up, and he said he thought I had just asked him something from outside, right next to the tent, not from where I had been standing. We didn't stay after that. We packed without talking much, and left the lantern behind because neither of us wanted to turn our backs to the trees long enough to grab it. When we reached the main trail again, maybe 15 minutes out, Ryan stopped and said something didn't feel right, and I asked what he meant, and he pointed down at the ground behind us. There was a second set of footprints following ours in the dirt, close enough that they overlapped in places, but they didn't start from the direction of the campsite. They started somewhere along the path after we had already been walking. It started off like every normal camping trip does, just two of us trying to find somewhere isolated enough to stay for the night before it got too dark. This was out near Blackwater Falls in West Virginia, sometime in early September, and it was just me and Ethan. We had been driving around looking for somewhere quiet to camp for one night before heading back the next morning, and eventually we found this spot a little way off one of the side trails where people had clearly camped before because the ground was flattened out, and there were old fire marks scattered around the area. We got there late enough that it was already starting to get dark under the trees, so we set everything up pretty quickly and kept things simple, just a small fire and some cheap food heated over it while we talked for a couple hours. And for most of that time, everything felt normal. But after a while, Ethan mentioned he kept smelling cigarette smoke, even though there shouldn't have been anybody else camping close to us. And once he said it, I started noticing it too, not constantly, just every few minutes, like somebody nearby had taken one drag and then stopped. And the strange part was it never came from the same direction twice. At first we figured it was probably another campsite deeper through the trees, but after a while it started feeling wrong because sometimes the smell would drift from somewhere behind us, and then a few minutes later it would come from farther off to the left. And once it smelled close enough that I actually looked around expecting somebody to walk into the firelight. Nobody ever did. Around maybe 10 or so, Ethan grabbed his flashlight and walked off a short distance to take a piss, while mine stayed sitting on a flat rock beside the fire. And after maybe 20 feet, I heard him stop moving completely before he called back asking if I had whistled at him from the campsite. I told him no, and when he walked back into the light, he looked uncomfortable in a way I hadn't seen before. He said he heard a whistle come from somewhere farther in the woods right after he stepped away from the fire, like somebody trying to get his attention without yelling. And we joked about it at first because neither of us wanted to turn it into a whole thing. But maybe 20 minutes later, both of us heard the same whistle again. This time it came from behind the tent. Just one short note. Ethan stood up immediately and aimed the flashlight toward the trees, and I remember the beam catching part of somebody's leg for maybe half a second before it disappeared behind a tree trunk. We started yelling, asking who was there, but nobody answered. And after that, the woods went completely quiet again, except for the fire popping once in a while. and neither of us really knew what to do after that, because leaving over something that small felt stupid, but staying suddenly felt worse. Then the whistle happened again, closer this time, right beside the tent. And Ethan moved toward the sound, while I stayed near the fire. And the second he reached the side of the tent, something sprinted through the dark behind him. Fast enough that I only caught pieces of it between the trees. A man wearing something pale over his face. We both ran for the car at the same time after that, throwing gear everywhere trying to leave. And I remember Ethan fumbling the keys badly enough that he dropped them once between the seats before the engine finally started. Neither of us talked much once we got back onto the main road, and maybe 10 minutes later, Ethan suddenly asked if I had packed the second flashlight from the campsite. I told him no, because when we left, both flashlights had still been outside with us near the fire. I remember that trip mostly because of how quiet it got before anything actually happened. We had gone out sometime in mid-December for a short overnight plan, not too far from the main road, and we found this clearing off a side path that looked used, but not recently, and I noticed right away there was no leftover trash anywhere, or burn marks from older fires, which felt a little off for a place that looked like people stopped there. But we still set up before it got too dark. There were two of us, and after we got the tent up and a small fire going, he walked off toward the trees to take a call where the signal was better, while I stayed back near the fire, sorting some of the gear. And after a few minutes, I heard something move from the side near the car, like a slow step pressing into the ground, and I turned, expecting to see him come around from the other side, but there was no one there, just the car and the dark line of trees behind it. And I stayed there listening, and then it happened again from the same direction, another step shifting closer into the clearing without coming into the light. And while I was looking that way, the car door eased open slightly and stopped. I called his name, expecting him to answer from somewhere nearby, but nothing came back, and I kept my eyes on the car as I walked toward it slowly. And right before I reached it, the door pulled itself shut, and the interior light cut out at the same moment, like someone had closed it from inside. And I stopped without touching it, just standing there close enough to reach the handle. And then I heard something move near the tent, a low shift along the ground beside it that made the fabric tighten briefly near the base, and then release. And I turned back and watched that area without stepping closer. He was still out near the trees. I could hear him talking faintly, and I had not gone near the tent since we set it up, but I still moved a few steps in that direction without thinking about it, keeping distance from it as I did. And the fabric along the lower side pulled inward again in one spot, like something was pressing into it from the outside, holding there for a moment before sliding away along the edge. And I stepped back after that and turned toward the car again, and the door gave a short movement, like it shifted slightly on its latch and settled back into place. Footsteps started again from the side near the car, moving across the ground at a normal pace without trying to hide the sound, and I turned and saw someone standing at the edge of the light facing in my direction, not saying anything and not coming closer, just standing there. And I stepped back and called his name again, and the voice that answered came from the trees behind that person. Same voice and same tone, like he was still out there and had not come back yet. And the person near the light did not react at all to that. And I moved toward the car quickly and grabbed the handle and pulled it open and got in. And as I pulled the door shut, something struck the front windshield from outside with enough force to spread a crack across it. And I reached over and locked the door right away. And I turned the key, but nothing came from the engine, and the panel lights were gone at the same time. Another hit landed against the front, and the glass flexed inward slightly where it had already cracked, and I did not stay inside after that. I pushed the door open on the other side and got out and moved away from the car toward the direction he had gone, keeping distance from it as I did, and I could hear movement behind me along the ground, keeping pace without closing the distance. And when I reached him, he had already started moving back toward the road, asking what was going on. And I told him to keep moving and not stop, and we did not slow down until we reached the main road. And when we went back the next morning with 2 others to get the rest of the gear, the car was still there, but the battery cable was pulled loose and hanging free-like. It had been taken off by hand, and that patch of ground near the tent had footprints across it, going in a tight circle around where it had been set up. The same path pressed deeper into the ground each time. I went camping with my friend Tyler out near Blackwater State Forest in Florida. Just a quick overnight thing because we both had the next day off, and we got there a little before sunset and picked a spot off a dirt access road that people use for fishing. Nothing remote, but quiet enough that you don't see anyone once it gets dark. And right while we were setting up the tent, I had my flashlight sitting on the cooler beside me, and we heard a truck come down the road slow. And come to a complete stop somewhere behind the trees. Not pulling in fully, just coming to a complete stop. And Tyler joked it was probably someone turning around, but the engine didn't shut off. And it just stayed there idling in the dark. I wiped my hands on my jeans and walked back a few steps to look through the trees. And I could see headlights cutting through the branches, but not the truck itself, like it was angled away from us behind a patch of thin pine trees. And then the lights turned off, but I could still hear the engine running in the same spot. That's when it felt off, because nobody got out and no doors shut, just the engine sitting there, running in the dark behind us. We went back to setting up like normal, but I kept glancing over my shoulder every few seconds without thinking, and after about a minute, the engine finally cut off, and right after that I heard a car door close. Just a single door, closing somewhere behind the trees, and then nothing after that. No footsteps, no talking, just complete silence around us. We made a small fire, using the dry sticks we had piled near the log, and tried to ignore it. But about 10 minutes later, Tyler looked up mid-sentence and asked if I heard someone walking out there. And I said, yeah, I hear it too, but it wasn't coming from the road anymore. It was coming from the side, like someone had already moved off the road and was circling through the trees around us. It wasn't even trying to hide the sound, just slow steps, moving over dry leaves, then stopping, and then steps again after a few seconds. I stood up and grabbed the flashlight off the cooler and pointed it out there and said, "Hey, who is that?" And the steps stopped immediately, like they didn't expect us to react that fast. I kept the light out there for a few seconds, but didn't see anything at all, just low brush and uneven trees in front of me. So I told Tyler it was probably someone else camping nearby. And we both sat back down again, but neither of us felt relaxed after that moment. And I kept my hand on the flashlight the whole time. A few minutes later, we heard the truck start again, but this time it didn't drive away at all. It just idled again in the exact same spot as before. And then the headlights came back on slowly, and they were pointed straight at our campsite, now through the trees, hitting the side of the tent and the ground near our feet. You couldn't see the truck itself at all, just the light cutting through everything and making it hard to see past it. Tyler stood up and waved like he was trying to signal them to move, but the lights didn't move or blink or change at all. They just stayed fixed directly on us. I told him to sit back down and not draw attention. And that's when we heard the footsteps again, closer this time now, not from the road anymore, but from behind us, near the brush line just past where we had dropped our bags. I turned fast with the flashlight and caught something move between two trees, low to the ground and quick, like someone stepping back out of the beam before I could focus on it. And I kept the light right there on that spot without moving it. I said, "Hey," again, louder this time, and took a few steps forward, and Tyler told me to stop moving right there, but I still went a little further. And that's when something hit the side of the tent hard. Like a full shove with force, enough to knock one of the poles loose and push the fabric inward. I ran back immediately, and Tyler grabbed the other side to steady it with both hands, and we both looked around at the same time, trying to see where that came from, and the headlights were still on us. But now, the engine sound had changed slightly, like it was revving a bit higher. I didn't say anything after that. I just started stuffing the loose things into the bag without organizing anything, because it was clear we needed to leave right then, and Tyler had already pulled the car keys out and was holding them tight while looking between the trees. Then we heard the truck door slam again, but this time it sounded closer than before, like it wasn't sitting at the road anymore. The headlights shifted suddenly and moved wider, like the truck had turned and was now facing the path, leading closer to us through the trees. I grabbed the last of the gear, and we both started moving toward our car fast. And that's when something ran across the path right in front of us, fast enough that I couldn't make out any clear details, just a shape cutting across the light and disappearing into the other side of the trees. Tyler stopped for a half second, and I grabbed his arm and pulled him forward and told him, "Don't stop moving at all." And we got to the car and jumped in quickly, and I dropped the flashlight into the cup holder while starting it. And right as I did that, the headlights from the other truck came through the trees directly behind us, not on the road anymore, actually moving in toward where we were parked. I didn't wait at all after that. I just drove straight out onto the dirt road and didn't even look back properly, just kept going until we hit the main highway and got distance between us and that spot. We didn't say much on the drive back, just trying to process what just happened out there, while keeping an eye on the mirrors every few seconds. And the next day, Tyler called the ranger station to report it, just in case it was someone messing with people out there at night. They told him they hadn't had any reports like that, but they would check the area anyway. We went back a week later during the day just to see the spot again in daylight, and there were tire tracks leading off the road into the trees, exactly where those headlights had been. Not a normal path at all, just straight through brush toward where we had set up that night. There were also footprints around where the tent had been more than just hours from before. But what stuck with me the most was how they circled the spot again and again, not coming straight in, just looping around it over and over like whoever was out there wasn't just passing by at all. They were watching us for a while before we even realized someone was there. When we were walking back to the car, there was already someone standing near the path, and I remember I didn't think much of it at first because we'd just seen one person earlier, but as we got closer, he just stayed there and watched us come through. And that's when it started to feel wrong, like he wasn't surprised to see us at all. And that's when it hit me that if we had stayed there even a little longer, we weren't getting back to the car like this. And the only reason I even went on that trip was because Jake had been asking me for a while, and I hadn't really been going out much because things at home were kind of tight. So when he said it was just a simple overnight near a lake about an hour outside town, nothing serious, I said yeah and went with them. And it was me, Jake, and his older brother Chris, and we got there late afternoon and parked off a dirt path, and from there we carried our stuff in maybe a couple 100 yards toward the water. And there were no other cars there when we got there, which felt normal at the time, just quiet in a good way. And we set up near a small clearing. Chris was messing with the fire, and Jake kept getting in the way, and I was just sitting there watching them go back and forth, and it all felt normal, just a regular night out. And it got dark pretty fast, like full dark with no moon. just the fire, lighting up a small circle around us. And after a while, Jake said he was going back to the car to grab something and asked if we wanted anything, and Chris said no. So Jake went alone with his phone light, and it should have taken him like 2 minutes to go and come back, but it didn't. And after a bit, Chris looked at me and said, "What's he doing?" And right then, we heard Jake call out from the direction of the path, not yelling like panic, more like checking if we heard him. And Chris stood up and called back, "What?" And Jake didn't answer right away. And then he came back into the firelight kind of fast, like walking quick, but trying to keep it normal. And Chris asked what happened, and Jake said he thought someone was standing near the car when he got there, like just off to the side. And when he pointed his light, it was gone. And Chris told him he probably saw a tree or something, but Jake shook his head and said no, it moved. And the way he said that made it stick, because Jake doesn't usually jump at stuff like that. And we tried to sit back down and keep talking, but it didn't really go back to normal after that. And I kept looking toward the path without meaning to, just expecting something to come through. And maybe 10 minutes later, we heard a step from that direction, like one clear step on leaves. And all three of us stopped talking at the same time. And Chris grabbed the flashlight and pointed it toward the path. And for a second, there was nothing, just the trees and the opening we came through. And then the light caught something low, like movement near the ground, and it stopped as soon as the light hit it. And Chris said, "Who's there?" Just normal, not aggressive, and nothing answered. And Jake said that's where he saw it before. And Chris took a couple steps forward, not far, just enough to see better. And I stayed near the fire, watching him. And then from behind me, from the opposite side of the clearing, I heard something move, closer than before, like right outside the light. And I turned, and there was nothing there, but it felt close, like one more step, and someone would be right there. And I said, "There's something behind us." And Chris turned fast and swung the light back, and for a second, it caught someone standing there, not far at all, just outside the light. And then they stepped back behind a tree. And Chris didn't wait after that. He just said, "We're leaving right now, pack it up." And Jake didn't argue. He just started grabbing stuff, and I was stuffing things into my bag when I heard movement again from the path side, more than one step this time. And when I looked up, I could see a shape standing in the opening, not coming closer, just there watching. And Chris said, "Don't look at them, just move." And that's when it clicked for me that there wasn't just one person out there. And we started moving toward the path together, staying close. And when we got near the opening, the one standing there moved to the side, like letting us pass through. And that didn't feel right at all. And as we walked past, I kept my head forward, but I could see someone else further back between the trees, just standing there. And when we got to the car, Jake unlocked it fast, and we all got in at the same time. And Chris started it right away. And when the headlights came on, they lit up the path in front of us. And there were at least 3 people out there, spaced out between the trees, not hiding anymore, just standing and watching us. And none of them moved when the lights hit them. And as we pulled out, one of them took a step toward the road, like they were thinking about coming closer, and then just stopped. And we didn't really talk on the drive back. And the next day, Jake looked that place up and found a couple posts from people saying they felt watched out there at night, but nobody really explained it. and we never went back after that. And honestly, the part that stuck with me wasn't just that there were people out there, it was how they moved around us without us noticing at first, like they were already in position before we realized what was going